Case 623 by Danny Yu. Chapter 51. Pierce finds himself watching surveillance videos again now that Johanna is showing a bit too much willfulness. He still isn't certain how to handle it, how to create a leader with the right view of the world without inadvertently making her a sheep. Little Johanna is glaring at her caretaker on the video he watches. "No!" she says. She doesn't stomp her foot as another child might have done, but her feet are planted like tree roots. "I don't want my hair cut, and you don't get to decide. You are not my daddy, and you don't love me, so I have to say you get to decide, and I won't." What a remarkably inconvenient worldview.
"Madame Rue," Tony said, plopping down into the seat across from her. "I'm sorry for coming here unannounced."
She remained silent for a moment, just looking at him, one growing eyebrow cocked. "I reviewed your team's latest suggestion," she said. "You have to understand that while we took them into consideration, we have to—"
"Find a way to compromise, I know," Tony agreed. "So long as it is a compromise, and not your people pushing things over our heads we can't live with."
Madame Rue sighed. "You know that I am willing to give you a lot of leeway, Dr. Stack. We must both do the balancing act. And frankly, you are not who most of my colleagues worry about. Ever since the Battle of New York, you have shown a remarkable judgment and character. And regardless of the armor, you are still a baseline human. Your son is baseline, if as remarkably intelligent as you. Your daughter, as you so kindly disclosed, is not. We believe this as much as anything gives you a uniquely balanced point of view on all of this. Your former teammates, they are a different matter."
Tony sighed. "I may have to change your mind about me after all," he said after a long pause. Up until the moment he said it, he could still back out. He could still sweep this under the rug, make it go away, but no. If this was to get off to a start where it could work right, he would have to be honest. "We are in agreement that I am not yet bound by the Accords, correct?" he asked. Madame Rue nodded. "I realize," Tony added, "that I am still bound by regular law, but I hope you might understand why I did what I did." He pulled the pre-prepared flash drive out of his pocket and handed it to her. "Take however much time you need to read through those files and the report," he said at last. "I have some work for Scar Industries I can get done. I can go sit with your secretary or—"
She gestured to the chair he was sitting in, even as she booted the drive. "Please stay," she said.
Tony flashed her a smile and pulled his tablet out of his briefcase. He located the file he had been working on and forced himself to get so lost in the work he wouldn't notice the slow, unbearable turn of time. Somehow, against all expectations, that part of his plan at the very least worked. The work he'd brought with him was engaging enough that he did lose track of time, to the point where Madame Rue had to repeatedly clear her throat and eventually wave a hand in front of his face to make sure he knew she was done reading. Tony quickly saved the file and tucked the tablet away again before giving her his full attention once more. "So," he said, trying very hard not to sound like a man walking toward his execution, no matter his actual feelings on the matter.
"As you said," Madame Rue said, "you are not yet under the purview of the proposed Accords, so I have no true grounds to judge you one way or another. All I can say is that if it was my order to give, I would have told you to do exactly as you did. You made the world a safer place, and that more than anything is what we hope the Avengers can do when properly regulated." She let out a long breath. "Preventative assassinations are not things to be taken lightly, although these individuals had clearly already committed heinous crimes." She paused a moment, eyebrows knit together in contemplation. "When an American Black Ops team killed Osama bin Laden, the world rejoiced, France not least among them. The few voices of dissent merely warned us that a life should never be taken lightly, and I don't believe you did that. The assassination of Osama bin Laden, however, while it was kept very secret and after the fact, and included illegally trespassing on another country, was planned. A democratically elected president made the choice. I hope I can trust that if another situation like this comes up, you will trust us enough to come to us with it and not give yourself and your teammates power to equal a state leader."
Tony nodded. He knew they both knew that even the UN would be in a tight spot if he had come to them. The UN itself did not have the power to issue kill orders. The Accords Council itself might eventually have that through the Avengers if the rest of the world was willing to rectify that part of the Accords. But even so, bringing this issue before the Council would have been problematic. Russia would want to keep the soldiers on their territory to themselves. The US and China would never stand for it, even if it meant sending in Black Ops team to extradite the soldiers. Great Britain and the countries where the rest of the soldiers were citizens would make noise but ultimately be able to do nothing. In the confusion, the soldiers would have either gotten unfrozen or their genetic material would have been stolen and used to reverse engineer the serum. The actions Tony, Rhodey, and Vision had taken with Bruce's support had left no genetic material to recover. It had been the safest possible solution, but as he had always known, perhaps not the truly right one. That was something he was going to have to live with. And then Madame Rue interrupted his thoughts again.
This is not a promise I can officially make, but if you ever find yourself prosecuted for your actions, know that I will put you under my personal protection and that France will never extradite you for it.
Tony let out a breath he hadn't even realized he'd been holding. Thank you, he said, and if it sounded more like a prayer than just mere gratitude, well, she knew why. The elders, too.
Always and whenever, Madame Rue said. I will put this confession on file at the highest possible clearance level. You understand I can't retroactively give you permission, not when this was done before the courts.
I understand, Tony said. I'm not asking you to. When she offered her hand, he took it. Thank you, he said.
Good day, Dr. Stark,
she replied. Tony flashed her a smile and had a feeling that for the first time in months upon months, he might actually get a proper night's sleep once he dove under the covers back home tonight. Thank God. If he'd still looked his true age, the bags under his eyes would have had bags of their own that even the best makeup artists in the world wouldn't have been able to hide. Tony's view of Christmas had always been borderline dismal, even with Anna and Jarvis's best efforts to make it a good time for him. The galas being paraded around, his parents' absences, all of it, really, had been too much for any two people, no matter how good and loving to make up for. Tony hadn't learned how to enjoy Christmas until his own children had come around to show him how it should be. No, as a kid, his favorite holiday had always been Easter! Howard barely viewed Easter as a holiday, so he tended to be hard at work or on the other side of the world throughout. Tony's mom went home to Spain more often than not. Once or twice, Tony had gone with her, but ironically, he hadn't really been much for long flights as a kid, so he usually stayed home, and Easter had become something almost like a fairy tale to his kid self. Uncle Danny organized Easter egg hunts! And not just the generic random ones where adults just put the eggs wherever. No, Uncle Danny would make it so that you had to follow clue upon clue and be smart and perceptive to get your reward. His and Aunt Peggy's kids would be there, and so would Dum Dum and Morita and Gabe's various kids and grandkids. And even though most of them were older than Tony, everyone had wanted Tony on their team. When he'd been real little, he knew it had been because he'd been adorable, and the girls especially had loved him. But he hadn't been very old before the different teams had fought for his brains, and that had boosted up Tony's admittedly fragile confidence for months afterwards. He barely even remembered ever being on the losing team. He wasn't sure if that was because he never had been, or because it had just been so fun, and it felt like there'd been no losers at all. There'd been that, and there'd been Passage with Anna and Jarvis. Tony wasn't Jewish. Honestly, he wasn't really anything religious at all. He was an American, and Catalan, Welsh, German, Italian, raised by a Catholic mother, a Protestant-raised non-religious Howard, severely Anglican Jarvis, Jewish Anna, and Catholic Uncle Danny, and that had probably, looking back, been so confusing. Atheism had been Tony's only escape, no matter how much he had never wanted to join Howard's side of things. Regardless, there had been something utterly peaceful about Passage, about the stories passed down and the traditions that were thousands of years old. Something about having a Seder dinner with the Easter egg hunt to look forward to had been strangely serene in a way very little in Tony's childhood had been. Sometimes he'd felt like Easter had been the one time out of the whole year he could take a proper breath after he'd been shipped off to boarding school. Point was, there was something grounding, something steady and true about tradition. And quite frankly, Tony had no Christmas traditions he wanted to pass on to his kids, which was why he'd allowed everyone else's Christmas history and Christmas traditions to rule ever since Jamie had been old enough to have a marginally functioning memory. Easter, however. This was the first Easter he'd had both kids, and Tony had done his very best! He'd let go of Pesach. There was no one Jewish around to lead Seder, and Tony sure wasn't going to, not without a conversion. He liked his bacon too much to go through with. As much as he wasn't religious, he still didn't want to blatantly disrespect anyone else. But he could do the Easter egg hunt. He can organize the best Easter egg hunt in the history of Easter egg hunts, all building on Uncle Danny's example. Vision had been all too happy to help, and the topmost floors of the tower had been full of Avengers and Jamie and Maria's new classmates, and watching his kids get picked first for teams simply because everyone knew how smart they were. Tony hadn't had a better holiday since Uncle Danny died, and he was so grateful to be directing and all, out of sight for the most part, where no one could see his face grumble. Had Easter been like this for Uncle Danny, he couldn't help but wonder. All fun and pride and a punch of emotion to the gut. They probably had been, Tony knew. And he was so grateful he knew. So many things in his early life had been uncertain, standing on wobbling, crumbling ground. Uncle Danny's pride and love had always been certain. Tony had loved Anna and Jarvis to death, but there'd always been the slightest taint to it all, lent by the fact that they were on Howard's payroll. If Howard had ever so much as tried to pay Uncle Danny even a penny, Uncle Danny would have laughed at his fucking face. Frankly, Tony didn't want to imagine what his self-image might have been, if not for that utterly certain knowledge. The classmates and Avengers dispersed eventually, and Tony was left alone with his kids, and the smiles on their faces, the pride in their voices. The near clogged his throat right up. All he could do was hold them as tightly as he dared and allowed himself to be truly completely happy for once in his life, safe and secure in the knowledge that the biggest recent threat against them was over and done with. Anthony, Jocasta said one morning in May when Tony made his bleary but well-rested way into the workshop after eating breakfast with the twins and seeing them off to school. "There's something you should see." Tony took a deep sip of his cup of coffee, already mourning the fact that he'd almost drained the whole thing already. To avoid a full day's mourning, he padded across the floor of the workshop and pressed the button to activate the workshop's coffee machine so that he'd have another cup ready when this one was done. How was it that he could be physically younger and more well-rested than he'd been, well, ever when those two factors were combined, and still so exhausted? Either it was the kids, or for the first time in his life he was sleeping too much. "How about it?" he muttered, plopping down into the first and best chair to enter his line of sight. A news segment was projected onto the wall ahead of him, and Tony felt his eyes widen. "The Avengers," he muttered. "What are they? Where are Rhodey and Vision, and do those idiots have permission to be there?" "It's a Hydra-related mission," Jocasta said, her voice dry enough to rival a desert, and Tony would be so proud of her if he wasn't so completely occupied by the way horror was washing over him. "No Rhodey, then," Tony concluded. "No Vision, no permission to enter the country, and no cooperation with local military or law enforcement." Because that was how Steve handled Hydra missions these days. Not even calling in Vision and Rhodey, even if they were on base because, well, Tony guessed because Steve was scared they'd find out something about Barnes and tell Tony, and... "If this doesn't end well," he muttered, suddenly feeling absolutely awful for not telling Steve there was no need to hide anything anymore, "the Accords will have to be And then that Hydra guy, who'd apparently been Natasha and Steve's teammate at some point or other, blew himself up! "Well, fuck," Tony said and reached for another cup of coffee. His old damn body felt numb with foreboding.